Baker Institute's mission is more vital than ever. We provide rigorous, nonpartisan insights that move beyond sound bites to inform policymaking. In 2024, we delivered on that mission, offering trusted research on critical issues such as border policy, energy security, emerging technologies, and a range of national security matters. On our Rice University campus in Houston, we hosted over 100 events, convening global leaders from industry, academia, and government for productive dialogues.
That's why institutions like the Baker Institute, Rice University is so important, because they help give an invitation for people to be pluralistic in their thinking and respect, to have the courage to speak truth to power, and have the courage to do their homework so that the truth can be better understood.
Our commitment to excellence and nonpartisanship has earned us recognition as the world's top university-affiliated think tank. Now, that success is made possible by the unwavering support of our community. Together, we'll continue turning ideas into action and shaping the future. Here in Houston, in Texas, nationally and around the world in 2025 and beyond.
Good morning. My name is Tony Payan. I am the director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute. Welcome. Today, we are releasing our annual Mexico Country Outlook in this, its 7th edition for the year 2026. As you may remember, this is the product of our discussions with many experts within and outside the Baker Institute. In this exercise, we seek to divine the challenges and the opportunities facing Mexico and the binational relationship in the following year. The Center for the U.S. and Mexico's Mexico Country Outlook report offers expert insights into these and other pivotal issues shaping the country's future, from public safety to water stress. Drawing on insights from leading experts, our annual reports examine major issues ahead to inform policymakers, business leaders, and the public in the coming year. Anticipating our conversation today, our experts believe that Mexico faces strong headwinds in 2026. Some generated domestically through far-reaching constitutional reforms that set the country's democratic clock back and undermine its economic performance. And some, of course, coming from a more uncertain international context. Our experts analyzed how the growing consolidation of government power will likely diminish regulatory oversight, reduce economic growth prospects, exacerbate social problems, and place further strain on sectors such as the energy industry, among other challenges. Our experts anticipate another uncertain year for Mexico ahead in domestic and foreign affairs, as pressures from a second Trump administration as well, through tariffs tied to immigration and drug enforcement, intensified in the lead up to the 2026 United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement review. So before we begin our conversation, some housekeeping notes. We've set aside about 30 minutes for Q&A in the second part of the event. Following my conversation with Raul Rodriguez Barocio, who will be moderating this portion, the second component will be moderated by Avery Franklin, who's here, a media specialist at Rice University. At the beginning of that portion of the event, Avery will share some instructions on how to submit your questions, both here in the room and, of course, the folks that are accompanying us online. We're happy to take questions in both English and Spanish and can respond in either language. Just let us know your preference when you ask the question. And finally, today's session is being recorded and will be available online immediately after the event. Members of the media are welcome to use any clips from this discussion in the reporting and attribution to the Baker Institute. We'll also provide a link to the full Mexico Country report. It went live this morning. So with that, let's get started. Raul.
Thank you, Tony. Buenos dias. Good morning. Thank you for being here with us. It's the 7th edition, and I don't only want to congratulate you and Rodrigo and all the staff and your team here at Baker, but also recognize the fact that this is a very small team that you have, and it's a remarkable job that you do on an annual basis, in addition to all the other events that you organize and the papers that you produce and so forth. You didn't say this because I guess you thought you had to be modest, but I think you've become the epicenter of a thought in terms of what's happening in Mexico and what's happening in the bilateral relationship. And it's no small feat. And needless to say, it's very timely. Let me start, if I may, and if you agree, by addressing something that you mentioned at the end of the report. And it caught my attention because the forecast that you venture there is that the country will hold steady, and I'm quoting. What do you mean by that? And particularly, what do you mean by that in the context, again, of what's happening globally from a geopolitical perspective, what's happening in Mexico, in the midst of so many things that we've seen over the past week alone. I mean, think of the tragedy in Michoacan and so on and so forth. What's happening in the U.S. With the election on Tuesday and the new trends that appear in the horizon. So I guess that by labeling the situation as uncertain as you did, that's quite frankly, it's an understatement. It's very uncertain. So how do you cope with writing producing a report on Mexico and the U.S. Mexico relationship and the level of uncertainty out there?
Yeah. Well, as I think Yogi Berra said, it's very difficult to predict, especially the future. And we try every year to call on the foremost experts on fiscal policy, on security policy, on energy, and on. And then we ask them to sort of look at the present, look at the trends, look at the data, and sort of try to engage a strategic exercise to look ahead at the following year. We don't ask them to look ahead at 5, 10, 20 years. That's almost impossible. But we believe that we have an advantage because we see the future as a little bit of a cone opening up. And so there's a lot more certainty on what could potentially happen tomorrow, save a black swan event, an earthquake, or an invasion or something like that in the world. But there's more certainty at the beginning of the cone, and then uncertainty grows as you project into the future, because obviously it's quite difficult to figure out what's really going to matter in the future. And so we have a methodology that we engage in this conversation and ask them to look ahead. But I think some of the things, identifying the variables that are going to matter and the trends in those variables allows us to sort of look ahead and figure out not 5 years, not 10 years, 25, but the following year, just at the beginning of the cone. And that's a good, useful exercise because it kind of helps us. Obviously, we try to anticipate some of the potential events like the elections on Tuesday and what they mean. President Trump's response will matter for Mexico. He might adopt a double down policy and try to distract from a Republican defeat by engaging in operations on the ground in Mexico, or he might reconsider his strategy and kind of back up a little bit. So there may be some uncertainty on his response over the days. And of course, in Mexico, the explosion of discontent in the state of Michoacan makes the social angle much more uncertain. But I think in the section on security, we do consider the fact that the security strategy in Mexico deployed by President Sheinbaum seems to be a lot more engaged, a little bit more realistic, but we also say that the resources are insufficient and her unwillingness to face down organized crime are going to complicate the situation. What we didn't anticipate was that once that particular social discontent when it spilled over into the streets and the local municipal palaces in the state of Michoacan, that she was simply going to deny and say that there are folks that have grievances that are not legitimate, that they're being manipulated by the right or by political parties and so on, essentially discounting the value of, or the discontent, the grievances that people have legitimately. And so in the midst of all this uncertainty, we think that it's still worth engaging in a strategic foresight exercise so that we can then go and develop the hypotheses, gather the data, and continue our academic work.
How disruptive do you see all these forces and events and the uncertainty itself in terms of where the 4T is today, and particularly the Sheinbaum government? And I asked that in the context of something that you mentioned in several different sections of the report, of the outlook, where you underscore the fact that the opposition, I dare say the oppositions in plural, in Mexico is fragmented on the one hand, and you use the word dwindling, and I fully agree with that. Is there any tipping point ahead where you would expect other forces to play a role, like, I don't know, in internal squabbles within Morena? What do you feel is going to be the political environment as we move into 2026 and beyond?
Yeah, I see a lot of uncertainty for a number of reasons. I think the reality on the ground in Mexico, economically, in terms of security and the growing social discontent, especially with the issue of security, seems to me to be growing bit by bit. It's a little bit like the frog in the water with the simmering fire. And I think President Sheinbaum was, handpicked by Mr. López Obrador and propelled into power and given essentially a playbook to implement the constitutional reforms, legislative changes, and of course bent on the idea of ignoring opposition voices, which haven't always been present in Mexico, and I think they're still there, and we're seeing them to some extent. Perhaps not coming from the political parties, but they're certainly coming from the middle class, which is a degree of discontent, from the economic pressure that the small and medium-sized businesses are feeling. Bit by bit, the news is sort of closing in on businesses by an aggressive revenue collection, which I think is sort of asphyxiating many of the businesses. But the president has stayed the course. A year into, 13 months really, into her presidency, she insists in sticking to the playbook that she inherited by the president, where the reality is already very different. There's more discontent. The fiscal situation that Mr. López Obrador inherited was fairly healthy, and the economy, though not growing at enormous speeds, 2% or so per year, was a healthy economy. The president comes in 6 years later, now entering her second year, so the 8th year of the 4th transformation of 4T, and clearly she doesn't have the money, she doesn't have the resources, she doesn't have the performing economy, it's flat, practically zero. She's not investing in the kinds of things that guarantee longer term growth, education, infrastructure, R&D, human development, and things like that. She's not investing in that because the fiscal policy simply is not there. The budget that was just passed, 10.8 billion pesos, I guess commits the country to borrowing another 1.8 billion for 2026. That puts a lot more strain, and that means that a huge portion, close to about 1 out of every 5 pesos in the federal budget, are now going to be to service debt. Mm-hmm. And then the social transfers that Mr. López Obrador committed, and she's doubling down on, cash transfers for elderly and youth, are also committing another quarter of the federal budget. So there's very little discretionary money to invest in growth. And so I think that the president has not yet understood that she is standing on a very different ground than the one Mr. Lopez Obrador inherited. But for now, she's sticking to the plan. I think 26 will be a very critical year. We'll see a lot more discontent and perhaps the articulation of the opposition. Maybe not the political parties. They really don't have the prestige to galvanize these opposition's grievances, but I think from civil society.
I assume that one of the fundamental components of that so-called playbook that she inherited, and you're using a metaphor, but it might be quite real, has to do with redistribution efforts. And again, one of the key components there was the minimum wage, but cash transfers, as you mentioned, are a crucial component of her popularity, which is substantial, as to at least this week. All of that is affected by the different trends in the economy that you mentioned, and I would add others like remittances falling. You know, that's a key component as of late. What can happen then? I mean, how? Because the fiscal picture doesn't compensate.
Yeah, I mean, those are really. I think I see 3, 4, maybe 5 elements in your question that I think are important to look at as we cast our eyes into 2026. The government has clearly said that there was a reduction in poverty because people have slightly greater income due to a tripling of the minimum wage from about 80, 90 pesos to 320 or so today. That is right. However, inflation has been very sticky. And I think it has eaten away, especially because food inflation is much greater than the general 3%, 3.8% or so inflation. When it's food that is going up 15, 20, 30, 40%, depending on whether it's tomatoes, potatoes, meat, etc., it's just eating away at the minimum wage, which is what most people make in Mexico at the bottom. And so clearly that, people feel it in the supermarket, just like we do in the United States. So I think the question that is more important is poverty has gone down, but is it sustainable? Can you truly reduce poverty in a country on the basis of cash transfers? When the economy is flat on its back in zero growth. The only thing that I think permanently lifts people from the more kind of lower socioeconomic strata to the middle class is going to be solid economic growth and solid investment in R&D, in human development, in infrastructure and things like that. That is not being invested in. So it is a very short tick up of the numbers when it comes to poverty reduction. I think it's not really sustainable. We see now that the debt is increasing, the revenue collection is becoming very aggressive because they're running out of money. So how sustainable are these cash transfers? I know a lot of people in Mexico have stopped receiving them. Very quietly, they suddenly just don't get the deposit any longer. So you can see the stress there. The other issue that I think is important is remittances. Remittances at a tune of $65 billion a year are now down by about 12%. I saw the numbers yesterday. The remittances, Mexicans sending money to their families in Mexico, are not only down. We know that many of the immigrants in the United States that send money have been deported. INAMI reports over 200,000 receipts of deportees. These are men and women earning money, sending money to Mexico, plus the self-deportations, plus the people who have lost their jobs in the United States or are kind of hiding, hunkering down, waiting for the Trump administration immigration policy to play out. And remittances are 3.7% of Mexico's GDP. So this could really hurt Mexico to a very large extent and its prospects for growth. So, and I think we're seeing that. We've seen it in 24, and I think we'll see it in 25. And the final thing that I want to say is on growth. This is where I think the country over the last 6 years, and this is where trends matter, whether this trend is reversible, has not really offered the conditions for investors, foreign investors, to truly pour money into Mexico. Most of Mexico's foreign investment is really brown field investment, which is reinvestment by companies that are already there. The actual greenfield investment, which is new companies, new money coming in the country, is really a very small percentage. And that doesn't guarantee the kind of growth that Mexico needs. And that obviously explains the underinvestment in the face of maintaining the social programs, the underinvestment in the things that guarantee longer term growth, and I think it explains the aggressive revenue collection that is asphyxiating many businesses in Mexico today, forcing many people even to go into the informal economy, and of course the already growing international debt, which will cost more money to service. So what I'm saying is the 4T, 7 on its 8th year now, is beginning to show serious cracks on the political project. You can now see the springs and the threads beginning to unfold, and it's not by political resistance. It's really because the project itself is poorly conceived, and I think doesn't really think very well on the real policies that can guarantee Mexico's midterm and longer term future.
I guess the audience might disagree in terms of cracks, but at least the term challenges is definitely there, and everyone will agree to that, including people within the Sheinbaum administration. One of the elements that I think is perhaps even more of concern has to do with what Santiago Levy presented here 3 weeks ago, which was an excellent presentation, by the way, and it's been distributed all over the place. How productivity has stagnated for decades in Mexico. And that undermines the capacity to grow in a way that can't be solved like other elements that you could define more as a juncture. Your thoughts on that?
Yes, indeed. Look, I just came back from Veracruz. I'll give you an anecdote so that I can then give you the gravity of the issue. As I was driving into the airport in Veracruz to come back to Houston on Sunday, I saw a worker, an airport worker, tending to the lawn at the airport on the road into the airport. And he was taking care of the overgrown grass with his hands in a bucket and a little cart. This is a young man, 30, 35, 32, something like that, cutting the lawn and maintaining the gardens essentially with his hands. That is the definition of an unproductive workforce. There's no need to have a healthy young person, and I think of him as a brain, really, that kind of talent and youth wasted, putting his hands on the grass. I think much of the Mexican economy is like that. People selling stuff in the streets, as mazapanes, this little candy, and doing this kind of work that is completely unproductive. Mexicans in the OECD invest in enormous amounts of hours. They're probably at the top of our investment for very little compensation. The only thing that makes a country grow is two things: population growth by sheer, propelling of the population growth, but the other thing is productivity. And Mexico has been stuck in low productivity, low investment in technology, low investment in capacities, low investment in moving people into the middle class, into jobs where they can use technology, use machinery, use computers and things to be a lot more productive. And the problem there is Mexico's always been a little bit like that. But I think the issue there is that if the country doesn't invest in brains, forget about hands and feet, in brains, in technology, and moving people into that kind of economy, it's going to be condemned to being a very unproductive economy, which is always going to cap Mexico's ability to grow beyond 2%, 0% now. I think the policies are wrong. The policies do not incentivize growth. And one more thing. When you force the wage the minimum wage to go from 80, 90 pesos to 300 pesos, many people say, see, there you go, that's good. But if you're a small business owner and you now have to pay 320 pesos a day instead of 90 pesos or 100 pesos, but your worker is not more productive, then it's coming out of your revenue, it's coming out of your pocket. So forcing the wage without investing in ensuring that that worker who's now making 300 pesos instead of 100 pesos produces 2 or 3 times as much, it's really a recipe for disincentivizing small and medium businesses to invest.
Add to that the other complication that you mentioned in passing, which is demography. The Mexican population is aging at a very fast rate. Over the past 50 years, median age in Mexico has increased 83%. Yeah. In the U.S., it's about 36%. So, I mean, the contrast is huge, right. And you can compare it with any country in the world, and you'll have Mexico as one of the countries that is aging more rapidly. That essentially does away with the demographic window that Mexico has been quote unquote enjoying for the past 40, 50 years. But it makes it a lot more difficult marginally to improve your lot.
Right.
So the old adage in terms of grow rich before you grow old applies to countries, and that is the case. So an additional complication.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think this is one thing that people in Mexico are not talking about, but we're watching it. If you haven't heard the podcast this week, I spoke with Bill King and on depopulation. This is a problem in the United States when you have low fertility rates and a policy that is driving towards zero immigration. Then we're going to be pretty quickly in the United States. We're going to be in that situation. But going back to Mexico, I think that this is one thing that people are not talking about. The number of folks that are being pushed into the roster of individuals receiving cash transfers, elderly, about 60%, is growing very, very fast. That is fiscally unsustainable when you have no growth and no investment. So that's going to be an issue. And obviously, as you move into an older age, you naturally become less productive or you retire, and then these pensions are now constitutionally guaranteed, but they're unfunded pensions. They're not people who, like we do, contributed to Social Security. Let's not get into the issue of Social Security, but they're not people who contribute to Social Security and then receive out of that in the future. These are people that are being moved into the roles that perhaps never really contributed anything, and so these pensions are being funded from the annual federal budget. And that, to me, with no growth, is practically unsustainable. So the pressure of an aging population, which is less productive, which then becomes a burden on healthcare, on pensions, and things like that, without really a change in policy that will make the country richer, it really dooms Mexico for a very long time. And I think these things have to change. And I think this is one of the things that the 4T doesn't really understand. They rightly so place emphasis on distribution. We should too. But they don't distribute what? You have to produce on the one hand to distribute on the other hand. If you're not producing here, but you're distributing here, then all you're doing is spreading the poverty. And perhaps eliminating poverty in the short term, but in a way that's not really that sustainable over the long term with an aging population.
Let me touch on the geopolitical context here a bit and draw your attention to what the report says in terms of the bilateral relationship. I think the outlook is rich in terms of concepts and in terms of views of what's happening and what might happen. By the way, we're celebrating the 40th year of Distant Neighbors, who Aaron Writing published while he was the New York Times bureau chief in Mexico City. And those of us who are old enough will remember the fact that it was an extremely popular book in Mexico and in the U.S. Sold somewhere close to 500,000.
500,000, $4 or $5 in revenue for the author.
Not bad. Not bad.
Yep.
That's why he lives in Paris now. So.
That's right.
Well, Alan just published a new edition, which came out, I believe, last month, or 2 months ago at most. And it's really interesting for a host of reasons. It's the same text, but he adds a new preface by Jorge Castañeda. Mm-hmm. And he adds some afterthoughts in terms of what has happened in those 40 years. And essentially what he says is, yeah, we're not exactly distant neighbors anymore, but we're nowhere close to being partners. So tell me what you think is happening and might happen in the midst of all the uncertainty that is even more complicated as you think globally. But let's take one angle that I think is particularly important, which is the China detente. I mean, what could happen there that will impact something that has become sort of a buzzword in terms of possibilities for Mexico, which is the near-shoring opportunities?
Yes, China, for a long time, at least 25 years, has been the unofficial partner of NAFTA and then the USMCA. NAFTA has been a big presence at the center of the trilateral table with Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Clearly, China saw Mexico as an opportunity to get a pied de terre in North America. They invested to some extent in Mexico. They certainly pushed a lot of goods in Mexico and in the United States, trying to really become a partner of North America, even though they were not part of the agreement. For a while, the Trump administration in 2017 through 2021, there was a lot of, the buzzword, I guess, just a few years ago was nearshoring. The idea that we've lost the manufacturing edge, the COVID-19, I think, exposed the vulnerability of these rather global scale supply chains, and there was a lot of fear among policymakers, and they said, look, we need to recover the manufacturing edge, and we need to reshore or nearshore or friendshore some of the manufacturing. So that was the buzzword just 3-4 years ago, right after the pandemic was over. Was certainly a big component of the public discourse. And Mexico is obviously, or at least theoretically, ideally positioned for the friendshore, given the agreement, and for the nearshore, because it's right next door, and lots of things do get made in Mexico and brought in: furniture, medical equipment, vehicle parts, and on and on. So I think the opportunity was there. Unfortunately, I think that the 4T, this political project, moved in the direction of disincentivizing investment. So we looked at the numbers and had many different conversations on what nearshoring meant, and whether it was brownfield investment, greenfield investment, and such, and we never saw the numbers. It just never materialized. I'm not even sure it materialized for the United States. China continues to be a huge, and I think they have certain advantages that we obviously are discovering now, rare earths and things like that. But I think the Obama administration, and then the Trump administration, and then the Biden administration, and the second Trump administration are all united in the idea that China's advantages need to be contained, and that there's a rivalry, a geostrategic rivalry. And Trump came in very aggressively in January, trying to push other countries to invest in the United States and cut off some economic ties or de-link from China. I think Trump over the year has realized very quickly that it's not that easy to do it, and it's not a short-term project. It's doable, but it's going to take 10, 15 years to do it. So he's kind of backing down a little bit, as he often does, and I think one of the things is he went to Korea and met Xi. And so it seems that they had an arrangement in which China will continue to provide goods to the United States, not the least of which, of course, rare earths. And all of a sudden, the urgency is considerably tamped down, the urgency of reshoring. There's a détente between China and the United States. And so Mexico's potential, although as of yet unimplemented by the government idea that Mexico could be a recipient of nearshoring or reshoring is not that urgent any longer. So all of a sudden it's like, because there's a detente between China and the United States, I think that Mexico's position gets weakened. Not that it ever materialized really, but it was always there as potential. But now with this new detente between China and the United States, for now, the urgency to reshore manufacturing is not there, and therefore the possibilities that these companies will be in a rush to move to Mexico is just simply disappeared.
And David Gantz is producing a lot in this
Yeah.
regard, right? So
David is
we should
our
expect-
International Trade and Economics Fellow. He's brilliant, and yeah, he sent me this email. He didn't put that in the report, but he sent me this email a few days ago, yeah.
Okay. One final question on my side, and it has to do with the fact that those of us who were active in one way or another in the NAFTA negotiation can go back and can find among the differences that you find with what's happening today or what might happen next year particularly, a very different urge to produce a narrative with regards to North America, with regards to regional competitiveness. Actually, James Baker himself made a comment maybe 15, 16 years ago on the fact that Bob Pastor's last book was a great contribution to building or imagining how to build regional competitiveness. We don't have that. I mean, we don't have the Bob Pastors in the world imagining perhaps utopias, if you like, but at least spurring some thought in terms of how to integrate in a way that was productive for the three countries. It's not there. We're very much in the survival mode in terms of regional arrangements. What do you think is happening there? Because there's a lot of material. I mean, if you think, for example, in Texas as the #1 exporting country for, I don't know, 23, 24 years, state, I'm sorry, 23, 24 years, interesting lapses. The relationship that we in Texas have with Mexico is astonishing. It's the total trade in both directions between Texas and Mexico is greater than the sum of the total trade with the following 7 partners, trading partners. And that includes China and Canada. It's huge. Should be in the news every couple of days, you know. This is by far the most important customer and supplier. Well, the same is true in the U.S. as a whole. Perhaps not as remarkable as that, but we don't have the census figures for international trade for August yet because of the shutdown. But most likely they will be showing that the U.S. is selling to Mexico and buying from Mexico as a #1 trading relationship in both directions. We already have a #1 in terms of total, but not in terms of suppliers. That's Canada still. So these are developments that we did not foresee 30 years ago. This is a huge accomplishment. It's huge, particularly in the context of a very fragmented reality from a geopolitical perspective globally. What's missing? Why don't we, as we say in Spanish, cacarear los huevos?
Right. Yeah. Thanks for the question, because I think it's a good opportunity to explain a little bit about why the Center for the U.S. and Mexico matters. It's very unfortunate that the Mexico Institute in Washington was shut down by the Trump administration, the Woodrow Wilson Center in general. I think there ought to be a U.S. Mexico Center in Chicago and in Seattle and Miami and Washington and New York and in Dallas and Houston and everywhere else, right? This is the most important relationship. I've always said that Mexico is the most important relationship for the United States. Now, I'm not saying that Russia doesn't matter. I'm not saying that China does not matter. I'm not saying that Europe doesn't matter. But we're here, and we have a 2,000-mile border, and we have an intense economic relationship, trade, investment, tourism, cross-border traffic. It's a very intense relationship. I think it's one of the most economically intense and largest economic relationships anywhere in the world between two countries. We're tied at the hip. We're really joined at the hip. I think that it's important to understand that. And we're not going anywhere. I think we have to find ways in which we have to live together. I think the Trump administration policies towards Mexico, while the complaints are legitimate, I think the approach is wrong. It should not be that way. But look, Mexico and the United States have been in dire straits before. You may remember the killing of Kiki Camarena in '85. It was a very low point. Obviously, if we go back further, there's been wars between the two countries, hostility between the two, and territorial disputes and things like that. So the ups and downs are always there. The last, I think since '94, there was a huge détente, there was an interesting resolution, and a vision that our destiny was really a common destiny in North America, together with Canada. And I think it was the right vision. There were mistakes that needed to be corrected. I think Mexico needed to do a lot more to ensure that it climbed up in its ability to take better advantage of the agreement. I think all the people that were left behind by the opening in trade and investment, the neoliberalism, had a legitimate grievance, I think. As many of the followers of Mr. Trump today, I think their grievances are legitimate. They feel left out. They feel down and out. So I think neoliberalism's mistake was essentially that it didn't look down. It just simply looked ahead and up, but it didn't really look down, and that resentment sort of built in both countries. But for us thinkers, people who are 24/7 on the binational relationship, we have to think, okay, how do we go back to rebuild a narrative with a clear understanding of what went wrong, starting in about 2008, 09, but certainly in 2015, 16, when both Mr. Trump and López Obrador began to rise as political figures, much more nationalistic. Leon Tolstoy said that I think nationalism was a mental disease. Not patriotism, one can be patriotic, but nationalism itself is a negative feeling because it sets us up against the others. You can be as patriotic as you want to. You can certainly cheer for your country to do well and on, but it doesn't, it's a more positive feeling because it doesn't set you up against the others. It doesn't see the other as a rival. It looks for the coincidences and the complementarities. And I think we need to recover some of that discourse and rebuild the idea of a North America, because at the end of the day, I think Canada, Mexico, and the United States are much, much stronger if we're working together on a platform for a good environment, for good jobs, for a technological future, than to be competing with each other. And by the way, I don't necessarily think that Mexico did anything better or worse than it was already doing vis-a-vis the United States. I mean, Canada has been the best ally, and they're getting the same treatment or worse. So right now we're in that mood. But look, nothing is eternal. I'm already at that age in which I know that everything comes and then goes. Everything that goes up falls down. And so I think we need to prepare as think tanks in the post-Trump era and begin to build the discourse. We currently have a new project that Rodrigo is working on, the Texas-Mexico Initiative. We need to show the evidence. And we need to show the Texas leadership, which often plays a double game as well, that this relationship matters and that Austin itself needs to redo its own understanding of the border and Mexico. Because I think the same things that Mr. Trump's administration is doing in Washington, the Abbott has been doing in Texas for 10, 12 years, however long he's been there. And I think it's not the right attitude. So it falls on us to show the evidence of why this matters, and then become interlocutors with our political classes to see if we can move policy in the right direction.
On that note, again, congratulations. Kudos to you and the whole team. This is a great contribution to making things better. and more importantly, in terms of projecting the opportunities out there for the future.
Thank you.
Avery?
Thank you, Tony. Our media guests, if you have questions online, please unmute and turn on your video. And when your video is on, it will show on the screen in this room. If you have questions in the audience, raise your hand, and I will start with a question that came through Zoom that you touched on a bit. How will the 2026 USMCA review affect all three countries, but in particular Mexico?
Yes, I continue to be optimistic about the USMCA. And what tells me that it will survive and the changes will be there and we'll figure out what they are, but I think the agreement will survive despite Mr. Trump's kind of occasional tantrum, is the fact that nobody's really talking about ending the USMCA. We're all talking about renegotiating the USMCA. And that is important because we almost assume that it's good. It's a good instrument and it should probably stay there. We may disagree on whether the national content should be higher or lower. We can certainly disagree on whether Mexico ought to practically expel China out of Mexico, which Sheinbaum has already started doing, by the way. She just, after Marco Rubio's visit to Mexico City on September 3rd, by September 4th, 5th, Sheinbaum announced tariffs on 1,371 Chinese products, essentially telling the Chinese you're not welcome here by through pressure from Washington. So clearly, because Sheinbaum has taken the strategy that whatever Washington asks, Washington gets. So on immigration, on fentanyl, on deportation, on not deportation, on extraditions of capos, on China. Her attitude has been, we don't want to provoke a bigger fight, we want to pick a fight, we're not going to provoke Mr. Trump's ire, so whatever they demand, that's going to happen. So the U.S. is going to come in, put certain demands on the table, and Mexico, my thinking is that it's simply going to say yes, 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 because they know that the USMCA is quintessential for Mexico's partial but continued relative health in the manufacturing sector and in producing the kind of economy that Mexico needs and preserving access to the U.S. market and capital. And so they understand that. And I think Mr. Trump will extract concessions on security, perhaps on water. Texas is very focused on water right now. They want that in the agreement, that there was security in the agreement. It would no longer be a trade agreement. It'd be an agreement with a number of chapters. On energy, obviously they're focusing on that. And I suspect that Mexico will seek by all means to save the agreement. It'll be there, and it'll have to make difficult concessions, but at the end of the day, I think Mexico has practically no choice. So my guess is that the agreement will survive. That's good, though, because once we have the floor, which is an agreement with all little imperfections, or even if it's a perfectible agreement, at least we have an agreement, and that we can build a narrative over that.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think President Sheinbaum is unwilling to take on organized crime? Is it just inability? And how much of the GDP are they sucking out? What we read around here is they're shaking down regular businesses like the old-style U.S. Mafia.
Yeah. This is a really complicated question. And I think, again, this is where I think Ms. Sheinbaum has to think very carefully about the reality around her and how much things have changed. We know that there's been lots of accusations, rumors, reports, journalistic pieces tracing a slow but steady weaving of relationships by Mr. López Obrador going back to 2006, where he approached certain mafiosi or capos or local criminal organizations and things like that to help him in his political project, to help him gain traction, political traction, and to help him co-opt certain constituencies at a local level. For example, in Sinaloa, which I think is sort of a more obvious case. So based on that, I think there were a series of important coalitions, tacit, implicit coalitions between the Morena party and some of these darker forces in Mexico. And I think the promise that Mr. López Obrador may have made at that time was essentially hugs, not bullets, abrazos, no balazos, right? So that was the policy, non-confrontation, we're going to leave them alone. It doesn't help him to didn't help him to defeat that narrative that he, we saw that scene where he shook El Chapo Guzman's mom's hand and told her, I got your letter, I'll get back to you, and things like that, little scenes like that sort of hint at these alliances, these tacit alliances. And so I think his policy was essentially, we're not gonna confront the issue of organized crime. The result is that it grew and grew, and it took, I think, not just territory, but more activities, extortion and kidnapping, and then eventually went into extorting money from agricultural producers like in Michoacán, and then eventually derived into smuggling fuel, what is known as huachicol in Mexico. So because they were left alone, and I wrote a piece a long time ago about why crime is not a static force. We often think that crime exists, it's there. But if you don't push back, what happens is that crime just grows. It's a dynamic force. It finds other opportunities. And more people enter the market, the criminal market, and it has its own logic, growth logic. It's, at the end of the day, it's capitalism, dark, black markets, but it's capitalism, so it grows. I think Mr. Lopez let it grow. And so you have to wonder, there's a couple of things why Ms. Sheinbaum has not broken away from that. Number one is, obviously, it would mean exposing her mentor and his alliances, his arrangements with these dark forces. And so it's a very difficult step for her to take. Eventually, she will have to do it. But we're into her second year, and she's been unwilling to do that and acknowledge that there is a problem. Number two, it would require her to step up to the plate and fight organized crime. And obviously, they're stung by the Calderón experience that crime also fights back. And so violence may spike up. They fight dirty, and Mr. Calderón learned that crime fights back. And the third element that I think is important in understanding why she hasn't taken that step is the fact that some of these darker connections may have threads straight into Morena. So if she were to begin to fight them, she would have to look into the connections, financial connections, and joint businesses and ventures between criminal organizations and senators, governors, mayors. And what that would mean is she would have to go after people in her own coalition, political coalition, and that would mean a fracture of the Morena party. And that, I think, is a very difficult step for her to take. So in many ways, she's kind of painted into a corner, and she just can't quite take that step. For the good of Mexico, Ms. Sheinbaum has to find a way out of the corner, has to take the right steps. If not, then it'll be another wasted sexennial or 6-year term in terms of the rule of law in Mexico, and it will depress the trust that people need to feel to go and invest in Mexico further.
Tony, but by the same token,
Yeah.
Isn't there an impression out there, at least an impression, that President Sheinbaum is, to a certain degree, taking a new route? And by that I mean, the accomplishments, again, the impression in terms of the accomplishments of Garcia Farfus as her Secretary for Security. Is there any room there to recognize the fact that, well, there seems to be an effort?
Yes, look, obviously Mr. Harfuch, Garcia Harfuch, who was a disciple of Genaro Garcia Luna, trained by Genaro Garcia Luna as a cop, because Genaro Garcia Luna was, at the end of the day, a cop, built the federal police that was dismantled by Mr. López Obrador. He knows how to do that job. He knows how to do that well. And he's been given the federal police but it's a very diminished force. You have a force of, the last I saw a few months ago, 12,000. The country is enormous, and the problem of organized crime is enormous. Where do you distribute 12,000 cops to conduct operations, investigations, prosecutions with the Attorney General's office, and things like that? So you have a very thin force. You have a very limited budget. In fact, the 2026 budget, I think the problem with the 2026 budget is that it even cuts the budget for his force by a little bit, not much, but it's a reduction, which means that it's not a priority for her. So he's telling him, look, do the best you can with the budget you got, with the cops you got. In the meantime, you got a National Guard, which is much larger. It was supposed to grow to 120,000. I don't think it's quite there yet. It may be closer to under 100,000 for now, but it's under full control of the military. And so they're practically a military police, an arm of the military. And the military, obviously, is a little bit stung, especially by the fact that the Marines were recently compromised in a corruption scandal. So they're probably rethinking about where they're standing and what they're doing and how to use the National Guard. I don't see the National Guard as active. They help local cops and things like that. But obviously what's happening in Michoacán and Guerrero and Sinaloa, Culiacán is at war. I mean, we don't often see it, but it's a terrible situation in Sinaloa, some spots all over the country. And so the National Guard is practically demobilized at this minute, or partially demobilized. And so Garcia Harfuch has a small force, a lower budget, and doing the best he can. But look, love is often demonstrated by money. And if security is really your priority, then double that force to 24,000 or to 48,000 or to 86,000, and give them the budget and give them the training and the ability to combat organized crime, even if it's not through kind of burn the village to save the village approach that Calderon had, but a more targeted, sort of set of operations on kind of hotspot policing type of thing. It would be a lot smarter, but the budget 2026 doesn't show that that's a priority, despite successes here and there.
I'm going to ask the question about the elephant that is in the room,
Yeah.
and you are not mentioning it.
Yes.
And we are a nation of cockheads and fentanyl
Yes.
heads. So you're talking about what is Mexico doing about this and the Sinaloa cartel,
Yes.
and all this and all that. But here is where the problem is.
Yeah.
And I refer to the question that the lady asked
Yes.
about the
Crime.
narco traffic and all that.
Yes.
I have seen videos of a son of the president
Yeah.
rubbing cocaine on his gums.
Yeah.
So,
You're right.
give me a break.
No, I'll give you a break. Let me tell you. By the way, I have extensively written on this issue, books and articles and pieces and spoken about that. And I think the person that had it right was probably Hillary Clinton when she said, "We are co-responsible." Okay, I think she was right. I think it's correct. I think part of the flawed strategy of the Trump administration is that it's not acknowledging that we also need to invest in rehabilitation, harm reduction strategies, education. There's a number of things. On the contrary, I think they're making the mistake of reducing. We just recently saw how they're trying to cut the budget for treatment and certainly the federal grants for specific organizations, civil society organizations that offer treatment. And we do have a very serious drug problem. 33 million Americans consume drugs occasionally or continuously. 10% of our population consumes drugs on a regular basis. So no, it's there, absolutely. But now the question then becomes, how can we build that narrative that we spoke about at the end, so that it becomes a problem that is acknowledged as a co-responsibility, and deploy joint strategies so that we fight the organized criminals in Mexico that do a lot of harm to Mexico and Mexicans themselves, and invest ourselves in reducing that demand, which ultimately is what pulls the supply. So we have to think of it as a regional problem. It's a joint problem. We have to be co-responsible. So in that sense, you're right. And it's not that we haven't talked about that. We haven't talked about that today, but we've written extensively on the issue that it is a joint problem. Yeah.
Tony,
Oh, sorry.
I really appreciate your information. You gave a great presentation. It was very insightful. But you also gave sort of a doomsday presentation of Mexico.
Yes.
Is there anything good coming out of Mexico? After all, 80% of the people in Mexico her work, and she had the highest rating of any president Mexico's ever had.
Yeah. All right, let me address the issue of ratings first. I don't know. As a political scientist, I continuously scratch my head about these 80, 90, 80, 70, 80, 90% approval ratings. I'd like to understand more what the methodology is, what people are thinking, because it seems to me that when you dig into the public policy ratings in Mexico, you ask Mexicans, and I've seen many other polls, how's the security situation? Bad. How is the economic situation? Bad. How is the investment in this? Bad. How is the president? Great. And so to me, there is a disconnect between public policy content and approval for specific public policy aspects being implemented by the government and the approval of the leader. And so I don't know why this particular disconnect, because the policies are not that promising. But if you look at Mexico and Mexicans, the approval ratings of all presidents, minus Peña I think was exceptional, but Salinas had the highest ratings, approval ratings, and Cedillo did, and Calderon did, and Fox did, and López Obrador did, and she does. So it doesn't really matter. People are not making the connection that policy is decided at the top to a very large extent, trickles down, and then people suffer the effects of policy. So why would the policy be wrong, but the leader would be right? So I think there's a conceptual issue that we need to look at, why people think that way. Now, going back to the other thing, let me give you the good news. I traveled to Mexico, whether it's Guadalajara, Veracruz, Monterrey, Mexico City, Chihuahua, Ciudad Juárez, whatever, continuously. I'm traveling continuously because I think it's important to be on the ground and understand what's happening on the ground. And I was just recently in Chihuahua, and I was in Veracruz. What was I doing in Veracruz? I'm the president of an organization, Pro Talento Mexicano, that promotes Mexican talent with the Houston Ballet. Don't ask me why. I don't know anything about ballet, but they asked me to be the president of the organization. I went to the Grand Prix, the Grand Prix that takes place in Córdoba, Veracruz every other year. Watching these young dancers, these jury and scouters coming from London and Berlin and San Francisco and Toronto and New York and Houston, obviously, and to judge and scout talent and the academies, ballet academies coming from Aguascalientes and Monterrey and Córdoba and all different Mexico to compete. And then I'll give you an example of Jeremy, this 11, 12-year-old kid from Córdoba, Veracruz. His parents, live in a corrugated metal hut, dirt floors. Talented kid. Competed, and Luca Masala from the Monaco Grace Kelly Ballet Academy in Monaco said, I'm going to take him. But they didn't have the money. That's how I became involved, because they asked me for money to send him to Monaco. That's Jeremy is in Monaco, studying ballet. I was in Chihuahua with entrepreneurs, investing in agriculture and in cattle ranching and in manufacturing in Chihuahua. There's a lot of success stories in Mexico. What I'm criticizing here is not Mexicans. I'm criticizing policy and the government and the leadership. That's where I think the failure is. Look, I think we've had many conversations in Houston about this In Texas, and you're a witness to it, my cardiologist is a Mexican. In the Woodlands is full of Mexican entrepreneurs, successful Mexican entrepreneurs. And you go to any construction site, and it's Mexicans. You go, people opening a lawn mowing company, it's a Mexican. You put a Mexican in the right spot with the right institutions and the right opportunities, and it shines. So it's not Mexicans that's the problem. It's the government, the leadership, and the policies where the problem is. Mexico is full of incredible success stories. I see them all the time. My aim is really at the top, not at the bottom. There's a Mexican middle class doing its best day to day. It's really the leadership, the institutions, the politicians, and the policy that are the failure.
Thank you. So we are past time, so thank you for the conversation. Thank you for your questions. The report is online, full of data, context, and analysis on these topics that we addressed today and more.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Ralph.